Dialectical thinking and grief. I'm Christy Bundakumara, Dr. B, psychiatric nurse practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience doing a grief series and working through that grief series myself. I have lost 3 children, continue to follow my story on how I'm processing that and how I'm turning my pain into purpose. So, what is a dialectical issue? Or, it's kind of like a debate, 2 things that seem very contrary to each other. There's a whole therapy based on this. It's called dialectical behavioral therapy, which stemmed off of cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'm a big proponent of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So it's most known for treating personality disorders, but it also treats that interpersonal conflict. And if you have experienced trauma or extreme grief, it creates an interpersonal conflict. And so we can use some of these ideas and processes to kind of reconcile our grief. This dialectical behavioral therapy also talks a lot about acceptance and change behavior, and really kind of getting to being able to look at these things as 2 truths that you need to take the time to reconcile, to bring into a truth for you, right? So I was raised in a pretty conservative, religious organization, Christian church that was very black and white, taught me that there is an absolute truth. And so what happens when we become adults and things do not seem to reconcile, right? And I talk about this in the Mentally Strong Method, spiritual conflict. If I think that there is a God that loves me and protects me, and that God allowed, and I believe that God has the power to save my children, and He allowed them to die, if I truly believe both of those statements, they seem, contradictory, right? How can those both be true? And so I talk about this a lot in the Mentally Strong Method when it comes to spiritual conflict. But when it comes to dialectical thinking, this is true of a lot of things. We see a lot of polarized thinking when it comes to politics or issues under politics. We see this in religious, different belief systems within religions that, there appears to be an absolute truth that don't actually align, right? And so someone who is able to actually practice dialectical thinking can look at both of those things and reconcile a truth for themselves, right? And that's what I'm doing here through the grief process. You'll see me, even though I do have a Christian belief system, I will be looking at other belief systems and their grief process and their beliefs about life after death or not, and really evaluating those things. So this whole process that I'm going through is part of that dialectical thinking. So dialectical thinking in grief, and we have all had this. If you have intense grief, you have experienced this internal conflict that doesn't make sense, okay? I can give you an example of Maya's death. And if you don't know Maya, she was 21 years old. She did have DRPLA, which is a rare neurodegenerative condition that she likely would succumb to at some point in her life. It was causing atrophy in the brain, and there is no known treatment. And even if there was some sort of medical advancement, it would be 10 to 20 years before that advancement would actually come into clinical practice, right? So she had this disorder, but she was not sick. She was vibrant. She was happy. She interacted with me and everyone around her in a very happy way her last day on earth. And the shock of her death, she died in her sleep, and the shock of her death and the morning of, and I won't give details, but the morning that I found her dead, all the things that occurred that morning are absolutely traumatic for me. Increased the pain, just changed who I am, right? Absolutely a traumatic event for me. That is an absolute truth. Another absolute truth is I am extremely grateful that she did not experience any trauma or hardship in her passing, right? And oftentimes when we're talking to someone with grief, we are trying to take the pain of the traumatic event away with a positive. Well, at least she died in her sleep. And those things are true. And when we're going through and we're trying to process this grief, we're trying to replace it. But I can't replace that pain. Both of those things are true. And that is dialectical thinking, when you can merge those and reconcile those as both absolute truths for you. And oftentimes I will make a statement of truth for myself. And we have a choice opportunity around this dialectical thinking where you can take those two things and then try to merge a statement of truth. But if I were to think about it right now, my statement of truth would be, the morning of Maya's death was absolutely traumatic for me, but I am grateful that she passed in her sleep. And as a mother, I would take that brunt of that trauma again so that she wouldn't have to experience something negative, right? So both of those things are true. But I also make a choice statement at the end. Like, I would choose to do that again for Maya, right? And these truth statements might be a little harder in trauma that you are a victim to, right? But, if you need to work with a therapist to kind of help with that, reconciling statement, and it might take time to really be able to make a statement that puts those two truths together and allows you to reconcile them. Another thing that we often do, like the grief, the loss of a child is absolutely unbearable. And oftentimes, especially my Christian friends are like, this is, God's plan, and, she and Reggie and Maya are in heaven and they are happy. And I do believe in heaven. I do. But it does not take away the unbearable pain. So again, dialectical thinking is not about trying to replace your pain with some positive truth. Okay, and this is why in the Mentally Strong method, negative thoughts and grief are a separate category. For your negative thoughts, if I had, negative thoughts of, I was a bad mother, I should have done more, those are negative thoughts and they need to be replaced. Okay? But in the pain of grief, you can't use positive thinking to take away that pain. And so, yes, the pain is unbearable. And yes, I am happy that they are eternally content in heaven. Okay? Both of those things are true for me. But, making that reconciliation, bringing those two together rather than trying to replace it. And so this is how we use dialectical thinking in grief. And this is why I'm always going back to the Mentally Strong method, because we have to separate these things, because we all know that we need to think positive. We all know that we need to to focus on the things that we're grateful for. And I am grateful that I have a belief system and that I have a deep knowing that my children are eternally content. I know that from, some spiritual experiences that I've had, okay? That is a truth for me. But it doesn't replace the pain. And so in grief, we need to use dialectical thinking rather than just positive thought or, gratitude lists and those kinds of things, like looking at those things and trying to reconcile them both as truth. Another thing is, I often think about if I knew my children were going to have DRPLA and, succumb to it and pass away, like, would I have aborted them, in pregnancy? Would I have never gotten pregnant? And the reality is, and I do believe in life, but the reality is I might have, like, that would be a very real possible choice for me at that time. And the fact that I would not give up the time that I had with my children. Like, both of those things are true. Like, I don't know that, we should choose to bring in that kind of pain into the world. And so both of those statements are true for me. And thankfully, I don't have to make that decision because I'm too old to have children. But you can see where this dialectical thinking comes into play. And it's kind of contrary to, our system of, there's absolute truth and I believe this and this is the truth. And when you have experienced trauma and grief and the world doesn't make sense anymore and you can't just make these arbitrary absolute truths, it's time to challenge yourself in this dialectical thinking. Another example is, I have seen miracles, medical miracles. I have heard of stories of people praying for things to occur and God blesses that and those prayers are answered. That did not happen for me. And believe me, it wasn't for a lack of trying. But can both of those things be true? Can there be a purpose for what I went through? I read a book last night that was kind of talking about somebody who uses her gifts to help people. And in that process, many people were kind of saved from some hardship. And I kind of got triggered, like, well, what if I would have met that person before? Could I have? Probably not, right? Can I acknowledge that there is a purpose for Reggie and Maya's life and death, and believe that, miracles do happen for some people, and still acknowledge how painful and hard this is for me? Okay, so again, dialectical thinking is about reconciling, not replacing. So when you have negative thoughts, which also happen in grief, right? I've often thought I'm not good enough for God to bless me. I'm not smart enough to find a cure for DRPLA. Those are negative thoughts, and those need to be replaced. But do you see how they get enmeshed with grief? So, but grief, we're not trying to replace that pain. We can't replace the pain. We can only learn to reconcile both truths. So, do a little research on dialectical thinking, because it can be applied to so many things in our life. But think about the statements that you are making inside your head, that internal conflict of, the pain that you're feeling versus, maybe some positive or some gratitude things, and then try to reconcile those in a statement of truth for yourself. And that is using dialectical thinking for grief. Continue to follow as I go through this educational series on how to grieve while I personally go through my 45 days of grief, because I believe that together and individually that we are mentally strong.